Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into apartheid, the system of institutionalized racial segregation that shaped South Africa for the better part of a century. We're going to unpack its roots, how it was brutally put into practice, the incredible resistance it sparked, and how it finally came crashing down.
All right, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll get a handle on what apartheid actually was. Then, we'll see how an entire society was re-engineered to make it happen. We'll also look at the devastating human cost, the decades-long fight for freedom, and finally, how this brutal system was dismantled. Let's get into it.
So first things first, to really get a grasp on apartheid, you have to understand the ideology behind it, the core beliefs that dominated South Africa for nearly 50 years. What was this all about?
You know, the name itself tells you pretty much everything you need to know. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word, and it literally translates to apartness or separateness. And this wasn't just some vague social attitude. This was a formal, state-sponsored system designed from the ground up to enforce racial separation.
And at the very heart of this system was a principle called boss-skap. It's another Afrikaans word, and it basically means boss-ship. The whole point of it was to make absolutely sure that the country's minority white population would dominate every single aspect of life, politically, socially, and economically. No questions asked.
Okay, so how does an idea, an ideology, actually become the law of the land? Well, after the National Party won the election in 1948, they got right to work, building this incredibly detailed, all-encompassing legal framework. It was truly an architecture of segregation.
And it all started by putting everyone in a box. The Population Registration Act of 1950 legally sorted every single person in South Africa into one of these four racial groups. And let me be clear, this wasn't just some label on a form. This single classification would dictate your entire life, your rights, where you could live, your job, your future, everything.
And what's really fascinating is how the system worked on two different levels. On one hand, you had grand apartheid. This was the big picture stuff, segregating entire populations, creating separate homelands. But then you had petty apartheid, which was the daily soul-crushing segregation of public life. We're talking separate beaches, separate buses, and those infamous whites-only signs on park benches.
And then a whole flood of laws came in to lock all of this down. There were acts that made it a crime to marry someone of a different race, acts that criminalized relationships, and maybe most importantly, the Group Areas Act. This one law decided where you were legally allowed to live, and it's what set the stage for massive forced removals.
Now, it's one thing to talk about laws, right? But these weren't just words on paper. They had a real, devastating, and tangible impact on millions of people's lives. They literally reshaped the country and inflicted an unbelievable amount of suffering.
Just try to wrap your head around this number, 3.5 million. Between 1960 and 1983, the government carried out one of the largest mass evictions in modern history, forcibly removing 3.5 million Black Africans from their homes.
So where did they all go? Well, the grand plan was to push the Black majority into 10 so-called homelands, or Bantustans. And as you can see on this map, these areas made up just 13% of the country's land, often on soil that was completely unproductive. The ultimate goal here was even more cynical, to create these little puppet states and then strip Black South Africans of their citizenship entirely.
And this image, this shows you what was really happening behind that political map. This wasn't some neat administrative plan. This was the forceful, traumatic uprooting of individuals, of families, of entire communities from the land they had called home for generations.
And the economic side of things? Just as brutal. Take a look at this chart. If you set white income as the baseline at 100%, you can see this massive persistent income gap for every other racial group. And that gap wasn't an accident. It was designed and enforced by the system. So how did the state control where millions of people could go, especially workers? They used something called pass laws. These laws forced Black South Africans to carry identity documents with them at all times. If you were caught without your pass, you could be arrested. This led to some powerful protests, like this Women's March in 1956, where their signs said it all: with passes, we are slaves.
But, you can't oppress people on this scale and expect them to just take it. It was inevitable. This level of oppression fueled decades of resistance, a fight for freedom that happened not just inside South Africa, but all across the globe.
So inside the country, you had groups like the African National Congress, the ANC, leading the charge. And the fight really evolved over the years. It started in the 50s with things like boycotts and civil disobedience. But after the Sharpeville massacre, things changed, leading to armed struggle. And then you have the pivotal moment in 1976, the Soweto uprising, where students rose up against being forced to learn in Afrikaans.
And how did the state respond to all this? With absolute brutal force. Events like the Queenstown massacre here weren't met with negotiation. They were met with bullets. But these crackdowns, they just hardened the resolve of the movement. They made people more determined, and the resistance grew even stronger through the 70s and 80s.
But here's the thing. The fight wasn't just happening inside South Africa. It went global. It ignited this worldwide chorus of opposition. The world responded with massive boycotts, targeting everything from South African sports teams to cultural events to, most importantly, economic investment. South Africa was becoming an outcast on the world stage.
I mean, look at this. By the late 1980s, you had these massive rallies like this one in Amsterdam happening all over the world. There was this powerful global consensus that this system was a crime against humanity, and it simply had to end. The international pressure was just immense.
So you've got this powerful uprising happening from the inside, and this suffocating isolation coming from the outside, and eventually something had to give. The very foundations of the apartheid state finally began to crack. And when the end came, it came fast. In the early 90s, things started happening one after the other. It kicked off with intense negotiations and the historic release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, a moment the world had been waiting on for 27 years. Just a year later, the main laws of apartheid were officially repealed. And it all led to 1994, when millions of South Africans of all races stood in line to vote in the country's first ever democratic election. Just incredible.
In the end, it really came down to what leaders like Sweden's Prime Minister Olof Palme were saying back in '86. The system was too rotten to be reformed. It couldn't be fixed. It had to be eliminated, completely and totally.
And so that brings us to today. The legal framework of apartheid is gone, it's history. But the deep scars it left behind, the economic and social inequality, they're still very much present. And this leaves South Africa, and really the whole world, with this profound, ongoing question. How does a nation truly rebuild and heal from decades of such deep, state-enforced division?